Let's say that you have podcast guests coming onto your podcast. How do you prepare those guests for your podcast? Initially, when you're outreaching to that podcast guest, you want to explain your podcast and what that podcast interview may entail. When I'm inviting someone onto my podcast, I like to let them know how to schedule the interview, whether that's a scheduling link, which is what I prefer, or whether we go back and forth on a date and time. But I prefer that scheduling link and then the invitation for them to book the podcast interview. Now, once they book that podcast interview, I like to use our scheduler and I prefer to use Calendly. That's going to automatically put on their calendar the date and time of the podcast and where they should be joining the podcast, whether that's on Zoom, whether that's on Riverside. The platform for them is going to be included all within those details. And what I like, and what's really nice about Calendly is I can set up reminders. I could set up a reminder for about 24 hours before and then an hour before the interview. So just in case something comes up on the end of the guest and they have to reschedule the podcast, then I know that I'm not going to be sitting there waiting for them while they miss the show. I like to share an agenda or an outline of the topics and questions in advance, and I like to just make it honestly just really simple for the podcast guests. I like to send them an email. Hey, here are the questions that I'm going to be asking you, and here's what you can expect from the interview. Depending on the guest and who I'm having on, sometimes I might have to go through and tweak the questions, and I just know based on who booked the show. I want to make sure that the guest has a good quality microphone, and if they don't, I'm going to want to reschedule the interview, and then I want to make sure that they have a stable internet connection, just so that way the interview doesn't become staticky or the guest potentially drops off the interview. And then I want to ensure that the hosting platform that I'm using, such as Zoom or Riverside, is I've tested it and I've made sure that it's working properly. Now, once I hop onto the interview, and I like to hop on about 10 minutes before my guest gets on, I like to make sure all my equipment's working. I like to make sure the lighting's working. I have the notes down of what we're going to be talking about on the interview. Then the guest hops onto the interview. And instead of just diving to the interview right then and there, I like to have a nice conversation with the guest, just check in, see how their day is going, how their week is going, and just making some small talk while they're on the show. And then once we have that small talk, I tell them, here's how the podcast interview is going to go. Here's what to expect. Here's typically the last question that I'm going to be asking you. Here's the length of the show. Here's their audience, so that they have everything that they need on their end to be a successful podcast guest. And it's really that simple. It's just making sure that your guest knows where to show up, what time to show up, and what they can expect from your podcast. And that's really how I like to prepare our guests for the podcast, because the more comfortable that they are, the better overall interview that's going to be.